Welcome to Artificiality, brought to you by the founders of Sonder Studio. Artificiality is a podcast dedicated to understanding the emerging community that is humans and machines. We take the latest in the human side, decision science, psychology, and design, and put it together with advances in artificial intelligence and big data so that you can understand how to work better with machines and your fellow humans. We founded Sonder Studio to help people be more human in the age of AI. We're on this learning journey too, so we strive to find the frontiers, to ask the best questions, and stay curious. We interview some of the top minds working at the intersection of humans and machines and make sure we have a few laughs along the way. Have you ever wondered why you can recognize and remember things but can't describe them in words? That is one of the questions that started Barbara Tversky's contrarian research and academic career that led to her theory that spatial thinking is the foundation of abstract thought. While most people were focused on language as central to human thinking, Barbara recognized that our relationship with the spaces we inhabit, including mental ones, provided a unique way of understanding the world. In her book, Mind in Motion, Barbara shows how spatial cognition is the foundation of thought and allows us to draw meaning from our bodies, our movements, and the spaces around us. We find Barbara's work to be incredibly fascinating, especially as we consider the current approach to AI and technology design. While there's an extraordinary amount of investment being made into language AI, Barbara's work causes us to wonder about the opportunities for AI that taps into our spatial reasoning. We're just starting to scratch the surface of this idea in our design work, and thank Barbara for uncovering the idea and sharing it in her wonderful book. In this episode, we talk with Barbara about spatial thinking as the foundation of abstract thought, the linearity of spaces and perception of distances, putting thought into the world, the creative power of sketching, self-driving cars, aphantasia, otherwise known as lacking a mind's eye, and the confusion between sight and navigational ability. Barbara, thank you very much for being with us on the podcast. We really appreciate your time. Perhaps you could start off with giving our listeners a bit of an overview of your book. We found it quite fascinating, but I'd like to hear it from you a bit to give the central thesis of the book and how you came to it.
Okay, so in some sense, I came to it in graduate school as a contrarian. At that point, people were, partly because of philosophy, partly psychology, partly intuitions, were emphasizing language as the main carrier of thought. And it occurred to me that we remember hundreds of faces. We can recognize them. There's no way we can describe them. Same with scenes. We have just a huge amount of information in our brains that we use every day, sounds of voices that don't have comparable verbal or verbal-like, proposition-like representations. So I love language. As a friend said, words are some of my favorite visuals. And I like using words. I like crafting things with words, but they seemed insufficient to capture human cognition and human communication. And it occurred to me that partly coming from a background of many artists, architects, and thinking about those things, it occurred to me that space takes up half the cortex, arguably, that it evolved far earlier than language, and that it had its own logic and its own structure, different from the structure of language. So language always served to me as a background, syntax, semantics, pragmatics. I love it, and it always served as a contrast, but also as a means of describing spatial situations, abstract situations based on spatial. So language was always there, but I thought spatial thinking was neglected. And what I mean by spatial thinking is acting in the spaces that we inhabit, including mental ones, with the things that are in it. And that, to me, formed the basis for other thought abstract thought in many ways, and the book tries to show that, beginning with the brain and going into language and going into diagrams and showing the spatial foundations of each of those into gestures, which represent thinking in many of the ways that language does, but less arbitrarily. If I point to something, you can follow my point. If I say something's big and use big gestures, or tall, or even if I say somebody's at the top of the class and gesture that, you get it right away. There's something natural about mapping those things to actions in space. So I started to explore the many ways we think in using space, using the objects in it, and then the spaces that we create that improve our own well-being, and in particular improve our cognition. So maps, diagrams, written language, all of those things. And they appear in ancient times, going back now 70,000 years, perhaps longer. And in many ways, those are the first concrete representations of abstract thought. We don't know when or how language developed, and we probably are unlikely to know, maybe, but at this point we don't. But we do have ancient representations of thought on stones, in caves, on bones, and everywhere. So putting our minds in space in this abstract way seems to be distinctly human. Gorillas don't do it, bonobos don't do it. They might gesture a bit. Apparently those gestures are mainly used for grooming or for sex or to grab something that somebody has that you want, but they don't represent how to get from one place to another. And the great apes might point, but their eyes don't follow the other's point. So it seemed to me, if there's a leap to humans, putting thought in the world was that. And the diagrams and maps and beautiful creatures that are in caves and on stones all over the world are the first concrete evidence of that. That's a long introduction to the book.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, the book itself, in academics, your brownie points are for publishing articles, especially theory. And Steve Pinker, Doug Hofstadter wrote books that were accessible to the public and opened that path for other people. Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And it was serendipitous. I met an agent. She said, "You have a book in you, right? Everyone tells you to write a book, right?" And I thought, how does she know that? So it seemed an opportunity to not be so uptight in my scientific tight genes and to reach out. I realized if you write something general and appealing to a large public, you're simplifying things, but then people simplify. So I should do the simplification. And it was just a pleasure and a joy doing it. It was hard, but and I based it in part on courses I'd been teaching, but which allowed me some expansion, although I quickly discovered you can't turn courses into a book. It's a different medium. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
It's such it must have been quite a project because it is a totally all-encompassing book in some ways. If someone had said, well, there's only going to be one book written about language, you'd scratch your head and say, that's never going to happen. It's just too big. And yet here we have really the book about how we think with movement and vice versa. So it's just such a treasure trove of so many ideas, which is figuring out where to start with some of the questions.
Exactly.
One of the things that I remember very distinctly is the way you talk about the spaces and linearness and, if you like, linearity. And I think you give an example. It would be great if you could describe it to readers of how we perceive distances differently depending on where we're, how close we are to. And I think you talk about Salt Lake City if you're from San Francisco versus the other side of the country, and you perceive these as different distances. I thought that was fascinating as a data point to break us out of thinking that we understand space, that we actually have to step back and rethink all space around us once you recognize that you're thinking and moving at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for that example. It wasn't mine, but early on, when I was beginning to study space, I first did some objects and then started thinking about space, and that it was distorted. And it was distorted by a number of, you could call them heuristics, that we do to remember things. And I collected them. There was a lot of resistance, both in the psychological community and in the geography community, that our representations, our cognitive maps weren't map-like. They were full of contradictions and ways to summarize things, heuristics. So one of them is perspective. And just as when we are at a mountaintop and looking out into a distance, the far distances get telescoped. They look like they're on top of each other. And the near distances, the things close to us, loom larger. And our representations are that way too. So this is a study by Keith Holyoke, a beautiful study, and I don't remember his first name, Ma, at Michigan many years ago. And Michigan is not in the middle of the country, as some people might think. But he had people there, many of who hadn't even left the state, imagine themselves in New York and estimate the distances between pairs of cities across the country, east-west. And yes, one was how far is Salt Lake from San Francisco? And if you're taking an East Coast perspective, that distance seems small. And the distance between New York and Philadelphia, or New York and Pittsburgh, which is about the same, seems large. But if you take a West Coast perspective, it's the opposite. The distance to Salt Lake from San Francisco seems large, and the distance between Pittsburgh and New York seems small. So and that phenomenon has been replicated in many places. Another one that is surprising to people is that people think that an ordinary place, say Jacques' house, is closer to the Eiffel Tower than the Eiffel Tower to Jacques' house. Now, that defies any Euclidean measurement, and it's a little bit similar to work that Eleanor Roche did. People think that magenta is closer to red than red to magenta, and work that my husband long ago did, that people think that North Korea is closer to China than China to North Korea. So China and the Eiffel Tower are landmarks. They can be landmarks in any space. I mean, 9/11 will be a temporal landmark, and people will move things closer to 9/11. So they define the whole region of the area around Paris, and the Jacques' house is just Jacques' house. So the region encompasses many things around it, and things are perceived to be closer. But it does defy. People think this is, again, work of my husband. The son is more similar to the father than the father to the son. So there are those asymmetries in that are conceptual and have to do with these prototypic stimuli or landmarks in any space that draw other things into it do that distortion. So there are a whole set of things like that distort our geographic memory, they distort our social memory, our political memory, or our representations. And the fact that they happen in space is one of the hints that we're putting these other spaces, we're mapping them onto space. So we have a space of a political space, more than one, and a social space and a color space, and we call them spaces. And they are, in some sense, mapped on the spaces that surround us and that we navigate in. And so the same phenomena appear in all of them.
I find that to be fascinating because being someone who's lived both in New York and San Francisco, thinking through that comparison, that makes sense to me. I can at least identify with maybe some long-seated memory. It's been a long time since I've lived in either place. That those distances feel different when you're in different sides of the country. It strikes me as almost the one that grabs me the most, is most intriguing, is the color space. Mm-hmm. Is thinking about red as a primary color being one of the dominant colors in the color space. Red is RGB. It is one of but even though I've spent a career dealing with color, it still struck me as quite sort of confounding, that comparison between red and magenta. I hadn't really thought about having color in the same space in a way that you could think about in terms of geography. It's a fascinating way to just sort of create a new mental model for me about how we think about the world, that everything has a space and that there are primary points in each that then create this sort of gravitational pull, or sort of magnetic. It either draws you toward or pushes you away from those central points.
Yeah, it's fascinating when you run that China-North Korea one through your mind, and it totally happens. You feel it. You feel that experience. And it seems that you could see that also with ideas and just with abstract concepts and with data, that you have a landmark on some big data point that you care about and that you know about. I don't know whether it's like, pick a KPI. Revenue. I was going to pick that. And then something else is not as much of a landmark as revenue, but it feels you benchmark it against that. You have that same asymmetry. And almost with decisions as well. I think Phil Tetlock says that you should flip sentences around. So instead of asking, what is the chances of XYZ happening, you say, what are the chances of XYZ not happening? And it causes you to just flip that thinking and think about it differently. And I'm wondering with that geographic one, whether we also think about how far apart they are as also being easier. Like if they're closer if we think of it, like I think of driving from New York to Pittsburgh as easy, and from San Francisco to Salt Lake is hard. Mm-hmm. And you can end up making that conflation as well. So you think that something's easier just because it's further away, because it's not because it's easier, just because you don't have that spatial reasoning locked down in the same way.
And you don't carry a genuine map or in your head. I agree with you completely. Those dimensions are going to be correlated. Is it easier? You think of driving, how I would get there as a surrogate for distance. And, of course, we use that all the time. When someone says, how far is somebody? You say a 5-hour drive. And you don't give the mileage. So we trade those things off. What it also, I think, reflects all of it is it's hard to think in dimensions, whether they're probabilities or dollars, and to allocate each point on 1 to 100 equally. We're drawn to categories. And Tetlock points this out. My husband pointed it out worked with Danny Kahneman in his work with that years ago, that you sort of say unlikely, likely, in the middle. We're not good at thinking in these more 9%, 10%, and Tetlock super forecasters are better able to do that. So we tend to categorize because it's easier. You're a Democrat or a Republican. You go to, if you're at Stanford, it's Stanford or Cal, and you don't see the nuances. It's simply easier to think in categories than dimensions. And so this kind of heuristic is really making categories out of, as you say, the landmarks, the salient examples. I mean, we think militarily that way too. I mean, the conflict in Ukraine, people keep saying, well, remember Chamberlain. So we have that scenario, which is before World War II, as a category, and we compare things to it. And it is an easier way of thinking than trying to lay things out on the relevant dimension or dimensions and evaluating that way.
I hadn't thought of categorization as essentially a failure of our ability to think on dimensions.
There are many categories that don't have dimensions, like furniture and fruit and vegetables. So the world does provide us with categories that are quite discrete, both in appearance and function. So there are categories in the world, and those are much easier to keep in mind and think about.
In the book, you have a list of the 9 laws of cognition, which is a wonderful way of summarizing a lot of the key thoughts in the book. There's one that I wanted to ask you about, which is the 8th law of cognition, which is when thought overflows the mind puts it into the world. And you've talked about this some in that it's how, going back thousands of years, people would draw things on caves, they'd express themselves in that way. But now our modern world has so many more opportunities to put things into the world, right? Lots of more ways to actually put thought out. But there's also a question of whether we want to put our thoughts into things that don't want to take our thoughts, right? So trying to put them into machines where there is no way to input, whereas it's quite different from picking up a pen and sketching on a pad. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that law and how you came to it, but also how you think about it in sort of the modern day.
Yeah, no, really intriguing questions. I followed what in retrospect looks like a systematic path in spatial thinking. It wasn't. It was intuitive, and only at some point I saw what I was doing. I looked at the larger spaces, the distortions in them. I looked at the space around the body, how we keep track of the space around the body as we navigate. And I looked at how we think about the space of the body, the relative sizes of our arms and legs and so forth. And in each case, I showed they were distorted by perception and action, each of them separately with separate reasons, because our perception and action in them or with them is different. And then I started thinking about the spaces we create to augment our own cognition. So sure, we build houses and make clothes. All of that is interesting. But I was more interested in the spaces we create to augment cognition. So those are the maps that you find in caves and on stones, which are startling and impressive, even ancient calendars. So, and I've looked a little bit at what people were representing. And they were representing other people, animals, bows and arrows, so implements they used. They were representing time in sequences of events or in calendars. And they were representing number in a very simple way, one-to-one correspondences. So these seemed to be the things that were important to people and that they were putting out in space. And they're still representations of time, of number, of people are what you'll see in the newspaper or digitally. They're still, and the brain gives them priorities. So there are all those converging reasons. But back to what we put in space. In many ways, all our scientific progress, if we want to call it that, or even our failures, military things where we've destroyed countries and people, all of that has depended on the structure of those external representations. So math, physics. Imagine multiplying 2 3-digit numbers without pencil and paper, but then imagine multiplying with Roman numerals. So all those, and then calculus and geometry, and without geometry, engineering would have been problematic. So that all the technological, intellectual, scientific, even artistic advances depended on ways that we crafted those external spaces. So again, you could argue not only are they the first evidence of symbolic thought, but they're the key to progress, such as it is. And again, you can see that in many civilizations. And each of those things builds on other things. And even storytelling we have captured in the Bayeux Tapestry and Trajan's Column and other places. So it's been fundamental to creating society. Numbers, how do we keep track of numbers and accounting? There's an argument that that's what led to written language, was accounting, keeping track of how many sheep you had, so how much taxes you owed the emperor or the tribal leader. So you can argue that again, that's what made humanity as successful as it is finding cleverer and more refined ways of putting thought into space, on paper usually, but now on a screen, and manipulating it, doing the computations that you needed. The other advantage it has is if it's out there, it's public. We can work together. So other people have done a number of studies showing that having some common workspace promotes collaboration and collective thinking and is key. And I couldn't agree with you more about the problem of sketching. I've been to many conferences on design and engineering design, architecture design, art, where people lament the going back, learning with pencil and paper and drawing that way and playing. So we studied architects who were making sketches. We gave them an assignment that they loved, experienced architects and novice, newly minted ones, and we looked at their sketches. They couldn't talk while they were drawing because it's not a verbal conversation. It's very intelligent, but not in words. And afterward, they told us things like, they drew for one reason, but looking back at their sketch, they saw new things. So they make discoveries in their own sketches. And we later went on to show it's the ambiguity that allows you to reconfigure what you've seen and find new meanings. The experienced architects were better, so they could look at a sketch of their building and say, the light won't fall well in the winter. That's not in the sketch. They have to make an inference from it, just the way a musician has to make inferences from their notes, and experienced musicians can imagine them, but inexperienced have a harder time doing that. So making inferences about what's in the world, what you've created in the world, depends also on expertise. And in chess, it's another, how many steps forward can you see in a board? If you're an expert, you can see many. If you're a novice, you're flummoxed. So those, and the very act of drawing, the hand movements make a difference. So one of the graduate students I worked with studied something similar in artists for whom drawing is their major reason for success. They're all highly successful artists. And they say they get lost in the drawing, that the drawing leads to other drawings, and that they deliberately get themselves in trouble because they're so adept at the hand movements and arraying things in space that they don't want to repeat themselves. So they do something uncharacteristic and see how they can get out of it. They make challenge. So even the medium makes a difference. Kentridge said, I can't think in color. I can't think with paint. I can think with charcoal. And you see how beautifully he thinks with charcoal. So that relationship of what his hand can do and how it appears on the page. And my guess is Picasso did better with a paintbrush than with charcoal, or with lithographs. So there's something about those actions themselves that are gratifying. A potter, all of that, they're gratifying, and they become a way of thinking in and of themselves. So experienced abacus users, if you take the abacus away, they mentally, or even they make the gestures they would make in calculating with the abacus. That's what helps them think. And we looked at people alone in the room doing multiplication without pencil and paper, and they're writing. In the air, they can't see it, but the very act captures what they would have seen and relates to it in the same way that seeing notes on a page to someone who sings, they can hear it mentally. So,
it's like I've got a password in my computer that's a pattern of keys.
Yeah.
I have absolutely no idea what the password is.
Right.
I actually have to look at I have to look at a keyboard to know.
You do the
what
same
it
thing
is.
with a phone when you're trying to remember, trying to write the key, the four, pattern key to unlock your iPhone. I watched you do this recently where you had to write down what the numbers were and you had to pull up the telephone keypad to remember what the numbers are.
Because I actually have no idea.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether that makes it safer or not safer. You go.
I want to grab what I know. We're both jumping into the questions. So I have one question about the generative act of sketching. You've talked about how sketching helps break fixation on an idea, that generative idea of sketching creates some alternative idea. That's one way to sort of break free of an intuition that's too fixed, is that you can actually get more creative by the act of sketching. What is it about that generative act? Is it just the exploration that you're seeing something new? Is it or is there something else?
Well, it's a great deal, again, the ambiguity that it allows you to reconfigure and to see things differently. So one example from these architects that were designing the museum is they put something somewhere and something else somewhere and something, and then they saw it was a triangle. And they could use that as a motif. So that ambiguity, they didn't think of a triangle when they were laying those things out, but they could reconfigure it, see it differently, and then use it differently. The artist, too, would often draw something, and then they look back at it and say, no, that isn't what I intended, but it is this. And now I can use that in this way. And I think if you go back and look at cartoons and sketches from artists, you sometimes get to see them in museums or online, you can see they did that. They made lines for one reason and the lines got co-opted. So and the CAD/CAM programs rectify, and that doesn't allow that flexibility of re-seeing. So think of poetry. Poetry is inherently, usually, ambiguous. And every time you read a poem, you see new things in it. And if you go to really fine art, you see new things each time. And it's that ambiguity that lets you see new things, interpret things in new way, see new relationships among things. So it's not completely dependent on ambiguity. You can get it from complexity as well. But complexity also allows you walk in a city which is complex, and you see new relations every time you go walking, or at least I do, and that's joyful. It's discovery. It's aesthetic. So, yeah, and it does free you. I mean, there are other ways of freeing you from fixation, and there's been a lot in the newspaper about some of these ways, like taking a walk or letting your mind wander, and those indeed can help reduce fixation, but they don't give you a good way to solve a problem. And so we looked at that other side of, can you both do both, release someone from fixation and give them roots to solving a problem? And this is work with Juliet Chow, and so one of the exercises that's often given in design classes is think of 10 ways you can use a brick. So it's using familiar objects in unfamiliar ways, and it's kind of fun. And that has been used as a creativity task. And in that case, some studies have shown that if you let your mind wander, or if you take a walk, you come up with some new ways that you hadn't thought of for using a brick or a ping pong ball. But it doesn't necessarily give you good ways. So we started thinking, what's a good way to search for new uses? And we thought, well, you could think of new places. You could think of events in time, like birthday parties. You could think, and then we finally realized, think of new roles. We know about roles from childhood. People say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what's your mommy? And so we know about roles. We know what firemen do and policemen do and conductors. So we know about roles, doctors. So that's very familiar. Roles involve events in time and also places. So they seem to capture a lot of these human experiences. And sure enough, when we told people for new uses of, say, an umbrella or a shoe, we pre-tested our items. And we told them, think of how a fireman might use it, a gardener might use it, an artist might use it, and so forth. And we compared that to mind wandering. People did way better with thinking through roles. And we could even trace the ideas that they came up with to roles. And people came up with more original roles that way than with just the mind wandering. So for creative thinking, you need both to free yourself from fixation, but you also need strategies that are domain specific. I mean, the new uses anybody can use, but I have a good friend, I often quote this, who's an excellent interior designer. And she says when she gets stuck, she goes to an art museum. So it's not letting her mind wander. It's deliberate. That's her way of freeing, as well as getting new ideas. And there are these kits for designers that give them that sort of thing. So digitally, there's a place where digital tools, I'm an architect, I'm designing something, I can easily call up just dozens of other buildings or interiors and use them as a way of spurring my own imagination. And, I think some of the issues with digital tools is learning to be good at them and learning to see what they can do. and where they're an advantage. So a student spoke yesterday on using virtual reality to overcome speaking anxiety. And there you can have a whole room full of people looking at you in an auditorium and practice your speech. To do that in real life would be very expensive. So that's, I think, good thinking about what can this tool do that our ordinary tools can't do. And then it's not that people have this law of the hammer, that if you give a kid a hammer, everything needs pounding. And they have the same idea with all these digital tools. Well, think harder about their relative advantages and what they can do that you can't do with paper and pencil or with ink or paint.
You said a few things about creativity and about joy and about freedom and about dealing with abstractions, but in a way that is creative and variable. Like there's a variability and unpredictability. And it such a nice contrast with statistical thinking and having to be like completely not variable in our thinking. And what struck me as you were talking about that is you can have the best of both worlds, right? So if you constrain the scope of variability, if you like, you go to the art gallery because that constrains the domain you're thinking in, as opposed to you just let your mind wander completely and you just come up with random stuff. Seems like there's a nice golden rule there that says when you're going to be, when you really do need to be creative, you're searching for insight, you need to open your mind. Don't do it so that it's just so open that you don't have a physical spatial guide around your own limits. There's almost if you walk around a city and anything's up for grabs, compared to going to the art gallery, you almost get this visceral guidance that comes from the space around you that says only focus on this thing. It's almost a way of sort of bounding the variability or guiding it into the right channel.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then even, if we're working on a problem, we can't help it stays there. We can't help but think about it. So even our view of the city or the art gallery is selective. And we're finding things there that somehow fit this problem that's circulating in our heads. So that also, it's an interplay between inside and outside. And on ambiguity and clarity, if I'm putting together a new bicycle or a barbecue, I want clarity. Right? I want the instructions to be absolutely clear. I don't want them to be like a Roscoe painting, right? So and sometimes with statistical data, I need actually the numbers to put into an equation in order to get the best possible outcome, so that there are times when I need the high accuracy and the clarity and the precision, both with numbers and language and with diagrams of various kind. And there are times when I want it to, or I need it to be more open. You listen to a talk and it might not be completely clear. You might not get all of it, but you don't need those details. On the other hand, you might. So then you are taking careful notes and worrying about the places you don't understand. So we're always dealing with that sort of thing. We looked at it at some point, this isn't in the book, in memory. And one of my graduate students collected undergraduate students, the stories they tell to each other when they come home at night or they come home in the afternoon to the dorm. And we asked them, did you exaggerate? Did you omit details that were important? Did you add a few details? And they all said, yep, we added details. We, not always, but often to make. So you're taking literary license. And then we did another study asking people how they respond to those things. And they're skeptical about the details. And so your roommate comes home and says, I have 4 tests in 3 days and I haven't slept and I have 2 papers and this. And the bottom line is your roommate's stressed out. You're not counting the papers of the exams. The message is, I'm stressed out. Stay away. Right? So we're always dealing with that, even in everyday life, with the clarity, precision. But yeah, sometimes we need clarity, and sometimes we need the ambiguity.
That there's a different kind of clarity and ambiguity that seems to happen between automated decision-making systems and humans. And I'm thinking very specifically about one particular example that I've found quite fascinating, which was the case of Qantas Flight 92, I think it was, from Singapore to Perth, when the Airbus autopilot thought that the plane was about to stall, so it dove the plane. And the pilot was a Top Gun pilot trained in the US who'd moved into commercial flight in Australia. But he was able to literally wrestle this plane back from going nose down into the Indian Ocean. And he wrote a book about this experience because he had to give up flying because the whole thing was just
traumatic.
Too difficult. Yeah, totally traumatic. And it did it twice, And he it's a fascinating story because he was one of the propositions in the that he put forward is that it was his flight experience in fly-by-wire jets, and in jets that where he had just this totally intuitive sense of how an aircraft is supposed to feel. And there's a lot of commentary about how there would have been very few pilots other than someone trained like him that could have rescued the situation. Mm-hmm. And there's this sort of gap between when the machines fail at something that humans are really good at but require so much training and practice to get it right. And we're going into this world of self-driving cars, mm-hmm. where it's one thing to have people like, power system controllers and pilots and, experts that can run simulations and can keep their training active. But I can't imagine a world where a 16-year-old gets a driver's license just cause and then never drives for 3 years, but then has to take over when something goes wrong with it. That just doesn't compute in my mind about how we think about the average human having to perform at peak performance but never having any experience. And I don't know how to pull that together as a way of thinking about modern automation.
I know you're right on with those dilemmas. Absolutely. And self-driving cars, in my mind, will work when they're all self-driving and not when you've got, but even then humans can cross the street in the middle of the street. I live in New York. Everybody walks, and now there are scooters and bicycles and everything coming in and out of traffic. It looks like Mumbai with a number of vehicles, and there it somehow works, or at least a little bit of it that I saw somehow works on the ground. But that is people kind of dealing. I mean, there are dogs that move aside for me on the sidewalk, so which is kind of surprising. But yeah, no, I share that. And when humans are more fallible, than the machines. I'm sure that the pilot systems are better because of these two near misses that are horrifying to think about. And so they do improve. Anticipating everything that could possibly happen is really hard. And I share your hesitance about giving up control. On the other hand, it's not, what if self-driving cars turned out to have fewer accidents than people, but still had accidents? And I think we're far less tolerant of accidents that machines commit than accidents that people commit.
Yeah, and there is definitely quite good research about how we judge machines differently, even with the same outcome. And
I just think the cars have to learn the cultural nature of driving in each individual setting. I mean, driving in Boston has one kind of cultural adaptation required because of the nature of Boston drivers. New York City is totally different. As one of my great friends who's lived in New York for a very long time, when I first moved back to New York, he said, no, just remember, lane lines in New York City are merely a suggestion.
Yeah, but on the other hand, in New York, and this I feel cultures, New Jersey is different from New York.
Oh, it's totally different.
In New York, they know it's all pedestrians who are going to walk on the street at any moment, and they're prepared to stop, and they don't slam on the horn because you're not supposed to, and so forth. On the weekends, they come in from New Jersey and Connecticut. They're not used to pedestrians. They're used to having the open road, and they go through red lights. And right. So I'm with you completely on that. The cultures are very local. On the driving, I was once taken from the Netherlands to Germany to catch an airplane, and the driver, who was very experienced, completely changed driving when he got into Germany from the Netherlands, because it's just a different. So and I think that's the stumper on self-driving cars, is the social, the dogs that run out into the street and the people, and we can deal with that. I'm watching that when I cross the street, the drivers, where is the driver looking? And if the driver, I'm not in the driver's field of vision, I better be. It's the same with people with walking with their phones and not taking in anything, and they think they are, but they're not. So even walking has become an issue now because of so many people looking at their phones and not at people around them.
I want to ask one question to help see if you can help me solve a personal quandary I've had for many years. So Helen has an ability to identify a thought and a memory based on where she is in space, in her environment. So she'll come back from a long mountain bike ride and remember one line that someone said in a podcast based on exactly where she is on the turn in a trail. And she can narrate the podcast based on the path that she took. And I've never understood how that's possible. I mean, maybe we're wired quite differently. I have no sense of direction. I come out of the subway in New York, and I have to look at the signs to figure out where I am going. Whereas you could spin her around in the middle of the dark, and she can point at a compass. But I'm curious about that ability to associate a memory with a place. Can you help me understand how she does that?
So I don't think it's that atypical, and I don't think it's dependent on sense of direction or navigating space. It's good to see that Helen is better than you, because there is at navigating, there is this preconception that men are better. And
oh no, I'm completely terrible and completely delegate. I sit behind the wheel and she just tells me where to go, and it's a wonderful, happy synergy that we found there.
My father was hopeless too. So, and each of my children is different. Some are uncanny, but remembering where you were when something happened is probably a good way it's probably built in some sense, because if you go back to the cave days, remembering where there was food or where there was danger, that's important to your livelihood, and you may have some implicit memory, even if you can't recollect it. And, that is the basis for the method of loci, which the Romans used to remember their speeches. So they would remember the walk they took through the market, and at each temple or spot, they would associate a certain paragraph of their speech, and then as they gave it, they would walk through that. And that method is one of the methods that memory experts teach older people who are having trouble remembering. It's one of the methods. Interestingly, it was the only piece, according to Jonathan Spence, a wonderful Chinese historian, it was the only insight, Western insight, that the Jesuit priest who tried to convert China brought to China. They were many of them were scholars and taking exams, because that was a way of gaining interesting occupations, and memory was part of it. And the method of this particular Jesuit priest in I think the 15th century taught them the method of loci, and they thought that was great. The book is called Memory Palace, and right. So, and I think my guess is even you who say you don't have that good memory of place, if you went back to places, it would evoke memories. That's my guess.
I have connection between feeling and emotion and place. I can remember myself in a space, and I can remember the emotion. I don't track the conversation or the thought pattern as well. We do a lot of thinking and walking. That's where a lot of our best ideas come from. And I know that's one of the legendary stories from Amos and Danny is the long walks and trying to, sort of break the back of new ideas. And that's definitely where a lot of our best ideas come from. And one of the reasons we love living in a mountainous place is we get to take lots of walks together. But I associate the emotion and the feeling, but not necessarily the fact. And it's kind of an interesting, it's an interesting difference.
Yeah, no, and conversation could be anywhere. But if you had memories that were deeply associated with a place, then my guess is they would come back. But right, conversation could be anywhere. It doesn't have any meaningful connection to space. So Helen is impressive.
Thank you. So many more.
Oh, well, fantastic.
I know we're right at time. I've got a question that's I hope you can take it 2 more minutes on this, but I'm wondering about if someone doesn't have a mind's eye, they don't have the ability to see and imagine in the same way that we do, that whether that gives them a different perspective on motion and on moving their thought outside their mind.
So blind people can be very good at navigating. It's spatial, not visual. And I think it's those of us blessed with sight and with visual imagery often confuse them. But blind people can navigate beautifully. They can understand abstract mathematics, geometry. They gesture. They've never seen gesture, people blind from birth. They gesture in many of the ways that we gesture, which is using space and actions in it to convey other information, to represent other information. So spatial can be independent of visual, and people can be very gifted at spatial thinking without having visual imagery or even vision.
You're quite right. I had completely put the two together. And as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, yes.
Oh, of course.
So what you're saying, it is a different system altogether.
And it's accessed by many modalities. So I know walking New York City where it's going to be windy. And I keep track of locations by wind, by smells, the pizza parlor, and the smells of garlic, the smells that emanate from places. And that is how blind people do it, the surface, how it feels when I'm walking on it. So, and all those cues, I'm sure we're using implicitly, and blind people are using them implicitly. But our sense of space is multimodal. It isn't. I mean, vision helps a lot, but it's multimodal and more abstract, and you can see that in the brain convergence. At the taxi drivers, the London taxi drivers that Eleanor Maguire studied, don't have a mental map of London. They just know they have a spatial feeling of where they are, how far they've driven, when they need to turn, when turns are coming up, and things like that. But it isn't that they're imagining a map in their heads and driving along it. And my guess is that's true of the two of you as well, that you know how to drive and walk places without having an image of a map.
Yeah. And I know that walking, even now, I could go travel back to New York City and I'd come around a corner and I'd lean in to the wind.
Yeah.
Because I'd still, even though I can't tell you exactly where that is, I know patterns to know well enough that I remember doing that. When I used to walk to work, I'd come around a corner and I'd have to lean in, or I'd know that's where the garbage is stored at the back of that building. You know, all of those kinds of things you do build this recognition through multisensory experience.
And how much spatial thinking goes into that intuitive process that you described if it's abstract reasoning? You talked about you weren't being systematic with your research, you were just sort of following an intuition. Marcus du Sautoy talks about that in terms of his mathematical proofs. He sort of gets a feeling, gets an intuition that this is a good place to go, that this is going to be interesting. He makes a judgment that it's worthwhile, as well as being a mathematical proof that's possible. And he describes that as an incredibly intuitive process, which I think for mathematics is almost one of the most interesting places to talk about intuition guiding us. Sort of, it puts intuition back into a bit of a positive light rather than flawed. You know, humans are intuitive and we make mistakes and all that kind of stuff.
So intuition can be honed from experience. And the best intuitions are honed from a great deal of experience. I mean, Danny Kahneman talks about this and had many conversations with Gary Klein, who's on the side of intuitionists, his firefighters who by the floor could tell it was about to collapse, get out of the building. But it's based on years of experience. So another way to think about it is sports. You look at basketball, that's incredibly rapid thinking. You have to fake out the other team, communicate to your own team. Split second, catching a ball, who do you pass it to? Or do you take it yourself and dribble? It's all split second, but it's based on, so it's intuitive in that sense, but it's based on years of experience and play. So that kind of intuition is on the whole good. You're riding the bicycle, you're going to have intuitions about when to slow down, when to speed up, how to take a curve. And even walking, we have those. But those, if you look at a baby learning to walk, it's very careful. And they fall all the time, and parents don't pick them up. They'll get up. They're okay. They're not going to hurt themselves. They're too close to the ground. You're learning a lot from that about building up the intuition. Remember learning how to ride a bike. It was deliberate, but then it became in your body, just the way basketball players play basketball. So those intuitions, even about people who we're going to like or who not, are built from a great deal of experience. They can be wrong. So, we can we're fallible even with a great deal of intuitions. My intuitions did take me to good places to study. There were places where my intuitions were mistakes. I won't go into those. But looking back, I can see where my intuitions were erroneous. I should have acted differently and didn't have the wisdom to do it at the time. But good intuitions are based on you internalize all that experience, and it becomes inaccessible. When you think about thinking or talking, words pop to our mind. We don't know where they come from. And unless we're speaking a language we don't speak well, we're not deliberately choosing each word. They just come out. And I think much of our interactions are like that. When I have to work hard on a new idea, then I become more self-conscious about how I'm getting the ideas and where they're coming from and how to manipulate that. But a great deal of our behavior is inaccessible to introspection.
Thank you for following your intuition, if that's what it was, and putting your thought into the world in the form of a book.
Thank you.
We both very much enjoyed it. It's highly readable and interesting, and I find myself, we find ourselves continuously probing the ideas and trying to figure out how to translate them to others. And thank you for taking the time to talk with us. We really appreciate it. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. I mean, what you're saying is very gratifying, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Spirit, stay.